Or the Dublin mystery. I always thought the history of that forge was all about the interesting as I had read, said the man in the corner that day. He had been silent for some time, and was meditative, sorting and looking through a packet of small photographs in his pocketbook. I guessed that some of these would presently be placed before me in my inspection, and I had not long to wait. That is old Brooks, he said, pointing to one of the photographs. Millionaire Brooks, as he was called, and these are his two sons, Percival and Murray. It was a curious case, wasn't it? Personally, I don't wonder that the police were completely at sea. If a member of that highly estimable force happened to be as clever as a clever author that forged will, we would have very few undetected crimes in this country. That is why I always try to persuade you to give our poor ignorant police the benefit of your great insight and wisdom, I said. I know, he said blandly. You have been most kind in that way, but I am only an amateur. Crime interests me only when it resembles a clever game of chess, with many intricate moves which all tend to one solution, and checkmating to the antagonist, the detective forces of the country. Now, confess that in the Dublin mystery, the clever police were absolutely checkmated. Absolutely. Just as the public was. There are actually two crimes there which have completely baffled detection. The murder of Patrick Weatherford, the lawyer, and the forged will of Millionaire Brooks. There are not many millionaires in Ireland. No wonder old Brooks was notably in his way, since his business, bacon curing, I believe it is said to be worth over £2 million of solid money. His younger son Murray was a refined, highly educated man, and was moreover the apple of his father's eye, as he was a spoilt darling of Dublin society. Good-looking, a splendid dancer, and a perfect writer, he was the acknowledged catch of the matrimonial market in Ireland, and many an aristocratic house was openly hospitable to the favored son of a millionaire. Of course, Percival Brooks, the eldest son, would inherit the bulk of the old man's property, and also probably the larger share in the business. He, too, was a good-looking man, more so than his brother. He, too, rode, danced, and talked well, but it was many years ago that mammas with marriageable daughters had given up all hopes of Percival Brooks as a profitable son-in-law. That young man's infatuation for Maisie Fortescue, a lady of undoubted charm, but was very doubtful antecedents, had astonished the London and Dublin music halls with her extravagant dances, was too well known and too old established to encourage any hopes of other quarters. Whether Percival Brooks would ever marry Maisie Fortescue was thought to be very doubtful. Old Brooks had the full disposal of all his wealth, and it would have faced ill with Percival if he had introduced the undesirable wife into the magnificent Fitzwilliam Place establishment. That is how matters stood, continued the man in the corner, when Dublin society one morning learnt with deep regrets and dismay that old Brooks had died very suddenly at his residence after only a few hours' illness. At first it was generally understood that he had had an apoplectic stroke. Anyway, he had had business hale and hearty as ever the day before his death, which occurred late on the evening of December 1st. It was in the morning papers of December 2nd which told the sad news to their readers, and it was those self-same papers which on the eventful morning contained another, even more startling piece of news which proved the prelude to a series of sensations, such as the tranquil, placid Dublin had not experienced for many years. This was, that on the very afternoon which saw the death of Dublin's greatest millionaire, Mr. Patrick Weatherd, his solicitor, was murdered in Phoenix Park at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, while actually walking on his own house from his visit to his client at Fitzwilliam Place. Patrick Weathered was well known as a proverbial town punk. His mysterious and tragic death filled all Dublin with dismay. The lawyer, who was a man 60 years of age, had been struck on the back of the head with a heavy stick, garroted, and subsequently robbed, for neither money, watch, nor pocketbook were found on his person. Whilst the police soon gathered from Patrick Weathered's household that he had left home about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, carrying both watch and pocketbook, and undoubtedly money as well. The inquest was held, and a verdict was willful murder was found against some person or persons unknown. But Dublin had not exhausted its stock of sensations yet. Millionaire Brooks had been buried with due pomp and magnificence, as his will had been placed, his business and personal belongings estimated to £2.5 million, by Percival Gordon Brooks, his eldest son and sole executor. The younger son, Murray, who had devoted the best years of his life to being a friend and companion to his father, while Percival ran over ballet dancers and music hall stars, Murray, who had vowed to be the apple of his father's eye in consequence, was left with a miserly pittance of £300 a year, and no share whatsoever in the gigantic businesses of Brooks and Sons, bacon cutters of Dublin. Something had evidently happened within the precincts of the Brooks town mansion, which the public in Dublin society tried in vain to fathom. Elderly mammas and blushing debutantes were already thinking of the best means whereby to next season they might more easily show the cold shoulder to young Murray Brooks, who had so suddenly become hopeless, detrimental in the market. When all these sensations terminated in one gigantic, overwhelming bit of scandal, for the next 3 months furnished food for gossip in every drawing room in Dublin. Mr. Murray Branks, namely, had entered a claim for probate of a will by his father in 1891, declaring that the later will, made the very day of his father's death, was proved by his brother as sole executor to be null and void, that will being a forgery. Part 2. The facts that transpired in connection with the extraordinary case were sufficiently curious to puzzle everybody. As I told you before, all Mr. Brooks' friends never quite grasped the idea that the old man should have so completely cut off his favorite son with the proverbial shilling. You see, Percival had always been a thorn in the old man's flesh. Horse racing, gambling, theaters, and music halls were, in the old pork butcher's eyes, so many deadly sins which his son committed every day of his life, and all the Fitzwilliam Place household testify that to the many and bitter quarrels which had risen between father and son over the latter's gambling or racing debts. Many people asserted that Brooks would have sooner have left his money to charitable institutions than see it squandered upon the brightest star that adorned the music hall stage. The case came up for hearing early in the spring. In the meanwhile, Percival Brooks had given up his racehorse associates, settling down in Fitzwilliam Place mansion, and conducted his father's business without a manager, but with all the energy and forethought which he had previously devoted to more unworthy causes. Murray had elected not to stay in the old house. No doubt associations were too painful and recent in nature. He was boarding with the family of Mr. Wilson Hibbert, who was the late Patrick Weathers, the murdered lawyer's partner. They were quiet, homely people who lived in a little pocky over the house over in Kinney Street. The poor Murray must, in spite of his grief, have felt very bitterly the change of the luxurious quarters in his father's mansion to his present tiny room and homely meals. Percival Brooks, who was now drawing an income of over $100,000 a year, was very severely criticized for adhering so strictly to the letter of his father's will. and only paying his brother a paltry £300 a year, which was literally but the crumbs of his own magnificent dinner table. The issue of that consisted case, which therefore waited in eager interest. In the meanwhile, the police, who at first seemed fairly loquacious on the subject of the murder of Mr. Patrick Weatherd, suddenly became strangely reticent, and by their very reticence aroused a certain amount of uneasiness in the public mind, until one day the Irish Times published the following extraordinary, enigmatic paragraph. We hear on authority, we cannot be questioned, that certain extraordinary developments are expected in connection with the brutal murder of our distinguished townsman, Mr. Weatherd. The police, in fact, are vainly trying to keep it secret, that they hold a clue which is of as important as it is sensational, and that they only await the impending issue of a known litigation in the probate court to effect an arrest. The Dublin public flocked to the court to hear the arguments of the case with ease. I myself journeyed down to Dublin, and as soon as I succeeded in finding my way into a densely crowded court, I took stock of the various actors of the drama, which I was a spectator and prepared to enjoy. There were Percival Brooks and Murray, his brother, the two litigants, both good-looking and well-dressed, and both striving, by keeping up their running conversation with their lawyer, to appear unconcerned and confident of their issue. With Percival Brooks was Henry Arnmore, the eminent Irish K.C., whilst Herbert Wilwert, a rising barrister, the son of Wilson Herbert, appeared from Murray. The will of which the later claimed probate was one dated 1891, had been made by Mr. Brooks during a severe illness which threatened to end his days. This will had been deposed by the hands of Messrs. Weatherd and Hibbert, solicitors of the deceased, and by it Mr. Brooks left his personally divided between his two sons, but had left his business entirely to his youngest son, with a charge of £2,000 a year upon it, payable to Percival. You see that Murray Brooks, therefore, had a very deep interest in that second will being found null and void. Old Mr. Hibbert had very ably instructed his son, and Walter Hibbert's opening speech was exceedingly clever. He would show, he said, on behalf of his client, that the will dated December 1st, 1900, could never have been made by the late Mr. Brooks, as it was absolutely contrary to his avowed intentions, and that if the late Mr. Brooks did on the day in question make any fresh will at all, it certainly was not the one proved by Mr. Percival Brooks, and that was absolutely a forgery from beginning to end. Mr. Walter Hibbert proposed to call several witnesses in support of both of these points. On the other hand, Mr. Henry Arnmore, K.C., very ably and courteously replied that he too had several witnesses to prove that Mr. Brooks certainly did make a will on the day in question, and that whatever his intentions may have been in the past, he must have modified them the day of his death. For the will proved by Mr. Percival Brooks found that after the death under the pillow, duly signed and witnessed in every way legal. Then the battle began in sober earnest. It chiefly centered around the prosaic figure of John O'Neill, the butler of Fitzwilliam Place, who had been in Mr. Brooks's family for 30 years. "I was clearing away the breakfast things," said John. "Then I heard the master's voice and study close by. Oh my, he was angry. I could hear the words disgrace and villain and liar and ballet dancer, and one or two of the ugly words that applied to some female lady, which I would not like to repeat. At first I did not take much notice, as I was quite used to hearing my poor dear master having words with Miss Percival. So I went downstairs carrying my breakfast things, but I had just started cleaning my silver when the study bell goes ringing violently, and I hear Mr. Percival's voice shouting in the hall, 'John, John, quick, send for Dr. Mulligan at once.' Your master is not well. Send one of the men, and you come up and help me get Mr. Brooks to the bed. I sent one of the grooms for the doctor, continued John, who seemed still affected at the recollection of his poor master, to whom he had evidently been very much attached. And I went up to see Mr. Brooks. I found him lying on the study floor, and his head supported on Mr. Percival's arms. My father had fallen in a faint, said the young master. Help me to get him up to the room before Mr. Malkin arrives. Mr. Percival looked quite upset, which was only natural. And when he had got the poor master to bed, I asked if I should not go and break the news to Mr. Murray, who had gone to business an hour ago. However, before Mr. Percival had had time to give me an order, the doctor came. I thought I had seen plainly death written in the master's face, and when I showed the doctor out an hour later, he told me that he would be back directly. I knew that the end was near. Mr. Brooks rang me for a minute or two later. He told me to send for once at Mr. Weatherd, or else for Mr. Hibbert, if Mr. Weatherd could not come. I haven't many hours to live, John, he says to me. My heart is broke, and the doctor says my heart is broke. A man shouldn't marry and have children, John, for they will sooner or later break his heart. I was so upset I couldn't speak. I went round at once for Mr. Weatherd, who came himself about 3 o'clock that afternoon. After he had been in my master about an hour, I was called in, and Mr. Weatherd said to me that Mr. Brooks wished me and one other of the servants to witness that he had signed a paper which was on the table by the bedside. I called Pat Mooney, the head of the footmen, and before us both Mr. Brooks put his name at the bottom of the paper. Then Mr. Weatherd gave me the pen and told me to write my name as witness, and that Pat Mooney was to do the same. After that, we were both told that we could go. He was present on the following day when the undertakers, who had come to the master out, found a paper underneath the pillow. John O'Neill, who recognized the paper as the one which he had printed his signature on the day before, took it to Mr. Percival and gave it into his hands. In answer to Mr. Walter Hibbert, John asserted positively that he took the paper from the undertaker's hand and went straight with it to Mr. Percival's room. "Here's alone," said John. I gave him the paper, just as he glanced at it, and I thought he looked rather astonished, but he said nothing, and I at once left the room. When you say that he recognized the paper as one which you had seen your master sign the day before, how did you actually recognize it as it was the same paper? Asked Mr. Hibbert, amidst breathless interest on part of the spectators. I narrowly observed the witness's face. "It looked exactly the same paper to me, sir," replied John somewhat vaguely. "Did you look at the contents, then?" "No, sir, certainly not." "Had you done so the day before?" "No, sir, only at my master's signature." "Then you only thought, by the look outside of the paper, that it was the same?" "It looked like the same thing, sir," persisted John obstinately. "You see," continued the man in the corner, leaning eagerly forward across the narrow marble table, "the contention of Murray Brooks' adviser was that Mr. Brooks, having made a will and hidden it for some reason or other under his pillow, that the will had fallen, through the means related to John O'Neill, into the hands of Mr. Percival Brooks, who destroyed it and substituted a forged one in its place, which judged the whole of Mr. Brooks's millions to himself. It was a terrible and very daring accusation directed against a gentleman who, in spite of his many wild oats sown in the early youth, was a prominent and important figure in the Irish high life. All those present were aghast at what they heard, and the whispered comments I could hear around me showed that the public opinion at least did not uphold Mr. Murray Brooks's daring accusation against his brother. But John O'Neill had not finished his evidence, and Mr. Walter Hibbert had a bit of sensation still up his sleeve. He had, namely, produced a paper, and he asked John O'Neill if once again he recognized the paper. "Certainly, sir," said John unhesitatingly. "That is the one the undertaker found under the pillow of my poor master, and which I took to Percival's room immediately." Then the paper was unfolded and placed before the witness. Now, Mr. O'Neill, you will tell me that is your signature. John looked at it for a moment, then he said, "Excuse me, sir," and produced a pair of spectacles, which he carefully adjusted before again examining the paper. Then he thoughtfully shook his head. "Don't look much like my writing, sir," he said at last. "Say that is to say," he added, by way of elucidating the matter, "does look like my writing, but then I don't think it is." There was a moment, a look in Mr. Percival's face, continued the man in the corner quietly, which then and there gave me the whole history of the quarrel, the illness of Mr. Brooks, and the will. Aye, and the murder of Patrick Weatherd, too. All I wondered at then was how every one of those learned counsel on both sides did not get the clue just the same as I did. It went on arguing, speechifying, cross-examining for nearly a week, until they arrived at the one conclusion which was inevitable from the very first, namely, that the will was a forgery. A gross, clumsy, idiotic forgery, since both John O'Neill and Pat Mooney, the two witnesses, absolutely repudiated their signatures and their own. The only successful bit of calligraphy the forger had done was the signature of old Mr. Brooks. It was a very curious fact, and one which had undoubtedly aided the forger in accomplishing his works quickly, that Mr. Weatherd, the lawyer, having no doubt realized that Mr. Brooks had not so many moments in life to spare, had not drawn up a usual engrossed, magnificent document, dear to the lawyer heart, but had used the client's will, one of those regular printed forms which can be purchased at any stationer's. Mr. Percival Brooks, of course, flatly denied the serious allegation brought against him. He admitted that the butler had brought him the document the morning after his father's death, and that he certainly, on glancing at it, had been very astonished to see that the document was his father's will. Against that he declared that its contents did not astonish him in the slightest degree, that he himself knew of the traitor's intentions, but that he certainly thought his father had entrusted the will to the care of Mr. Weatherd, who did all his business for him. "I'm only curiously against the signature," he concluded, speaking in a perfectly calm and clear voice. "You must understand that I thought the forgery was very far from my mind, and my father's signature was exceedingly well imitated, if indeed it is not his own, which I am not at all prepared to believe. As for the two witnesses' signatures, I don't think I had ever seen them before. I took the documents to Messrs. Barks and Maud, who had often done business with me before, and they assured me that it was perfect form and in order. Asked why he had not entrusted the will to his father's solicitors, he replied, "For the very simple reason that exactly half an hour before the will was placed in my hands, I had read that Mr. Patrick Merritt had been murdered the night before. Mr. Hibbert, the junior partner, was not personally known to me." After that, for form's sake, a good deal of expert evidence was heard on the subject of the dead man's signature. But that was quite unanimous, and merely went to corroborate what had already been established beyond a doubt. Namely, the will dated December 1st, 1900, was a forgery, and probate of the will dated 1891 was therefore granted to Mr. Murray Brooks, the sole executor of mentioned to them. Anyway, Part 3. 2 days later, the police applied for a warrant for the arrest of Mr. Percival Brooks on a charge of forgery. The Crown prosecuted, and Mr. Brooks had again the support of Mr. Oldmeyer, the eminent K.C. Perfectly calm, like a man conscious of his own innocence and unable to grasp the idea that justice does sometimes miscarry, Mr. Brooks, the son of the millionaire, himself still the prisoner of a very large fortune, under the former will, stood up in the dock on that memorable day of May 1902, which still no doubt lives in the memory of many of his friends. All the evidence with regard to Mr. Brooks' last moments in the forged will was gone through over again. That will, it was a contention of the Crown, had been forged so entirely in favor of the accused, cutting out everyone else, that obviously no one but the beneficiary under that false will would have had any motive in forging it. Very pale, and with a frown between his deep-set, handsome Irish eyes, Percival Brooks listened to this large volume of evidence piled up against him by the Crown. At times he held brief consultations with Mr. Ormer, who seemed cool as a cucumber. Have you seen the Ormer in court? He is a character worthy of Dickens. His pronounced brogue, his fat, podgy, clean-shaven cheeks, his not always immaculately clean large hands, and often delighted the caricaturist. As it was very soon transpired that memorable magisterial inquiry, he relied for a verdict in favor of his client upon two main points, and he had concentrated all his skill upon making those 2 points as telling as he possibly could. The first point was a question of time. John O'Neill, cross-examined by Ormore, stated without hesitation that he had given the will to Mr. Percival at 11 o'clock in the morning. And now the eminent K.C. brought forward and placed in the witnesses' box the very lawyers into whose hands the accused had then immediately placed the will. Now Mr. Barkston, a very well-known solicitor of King Street, declared positively that Mr. Percival Brooks was in his office at 12:15. 2 of his clerks testified at the exact same time, and it was impossible, contended Mr. Ormore, that within 3/4 of an hour Mr. Brooks could have gone from the stationer's brought will form, copied Mr. Wethering's writing, his father's signature, and that of John O'Neill and Pat Rooney. Such a thing might have been planned, arranged, practiced, or ultimately, after a great deal of trouble, successfully carried out. But human intelligence could not grasp the other as a possibility. Still, the judge wavered. The eminent K.C. had shaken but not shattered his belief in the prisoner's guilt. But there was one more point, and this Ormore, with the skill of a dramatist, had reserved for the fall of the curtain. He noted every sign in the judge's face. He guessed that his client had not yet been absolutely safe. Then only did he produce his last 2 witnesses. One of them was Mary Sullivan, one of the housemaids in the Fitzwilliam mansion. She had been sent up by the cook at 4:15 o'clock in the afternoon of December 1st with some hot water, which the nurse had ordered for the master's room. Just as she was about to knock on the door, Mr. Weatherd was coming out of the room. Mary stopped with a tray in her hand, and at the door Mr. Weatherd turned and said, quite aloud, "Now, don't fret, don't be anxious, don't try and be calm. Your will is safe in my pocket. Nothing can change it, and alter one word of it but yourself." It was, of course, a very ticklish point to the law, whether the housemaid's evidence could be accepted. You see, she was quoting the words of a man since dead, spoken to another man, also dead. There's no doubt that had there been very strong evidence on the other side against Percival Brooks, Mary Sullivan's would have counted for nothing. But I told you that before the judge's belief in the prisoner's guilt was already very seriously shaken, and now the final blow aimed at it by Mr. Ormore's shattered any last lingering doubts. Dr. Mulligan, namely, was placed into the box by Mr. Ormore and the witness. He was a medical man of impeccable authority, in fact, absolutely at the head of the profession in Dublin. What he said practically corroborated Mary Sullivan's testimony. He had gone in to see Mr. Brooks at 4:30, and understood from him that his lawyer had just left him. Mr. Brooks certainly, though terribly weak and calm, more composed. He was dying from a sudden attack, and Dr. Mulligan foresaw the almost immediate end. But he was still conscious, and managed to murmur feebly, "I feel much easier in my mind now, doctor. I have made my will. Whether it has been. He's got it in his pocket. It is safe there. Safe from..." But the words died on his lips. No, after that he spoke but little. He saw his 2 sons before he died, but hardly knew them or even looked at them. You see, concluded the man in the corner, you see that the prosecution was bound to collapse. Ormore did not give it a leg to stand upon. The will was forged, it is true, forged in favor of Percival Brooks, and of no one else. Forged for him, for his benefit. Whether he knew and connived at the forgery was never proved, for, as far as I know, even himself. But it was impossible to go against the evidence, which pointed that, as far as the act itself was concerned, he at least was most innocent. You see, Dr. Mulligan's evidence was not to be shaken. Mary Sullivan's was equally strong. There were 2 witnesses swearing positively that old Brooks' will was in Mr. Weathers's keeping when that gentleman left Fitzwarren Mansion at the 4:15. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the lawyer was found dead in Phoenix Park. Between 4:15 and 8 o'clock in the evening, Percival Brooks never left the house, and was subsequently proved by Ormore beyond a doubt. Since the will found under Brooks's pillow was a forged will, where then was the will he did make, and Weathered carried away with him in his pocket? Stolen, of course, I said. By those who murdered and robbed him. It may have been no value to them, and they naturally would destroy it, lest it was proven to clear against him. Then you think it was mere coincidence? I asked excitedly. What? That Weathered was murdered and robbed at the very moment that he carried the will in his pocket while another was being forged in its place. It certainly would be very curious if it were a mere coincidence, I said musingly. Very, he repeated with biting sarcasm, whilst nervously his bony fingers played with the inevitable bit of string. Very curious indeed. Just think of the whole thing. There was the old man with all his wealth, the 2 sons, one of whom he is devoted, and the other with whom he does nothing but quarrel. One day there is another of these quarrels, but more violent, more terrible than any had previously occurred, with the result that the father, heartbroken by it all, has an attack of the heart, practically dies of a broken heart. After that he alters his will, and subsequently a will is proved which turns out to be a forgery. Now everybody, police, press, and the public alike, once jumped to the conclusion that, as Percival Brooks benefits the forged will, Percival Brooks must be the forger. Seek for him who the crime benefits, is your own axiom, I argued. I beg your pardon? Percival Brooks benefited to the tune of £2 million. I beg your pardon, he did nothing of the sort. He was left with less than half the share that of his younger brother inherited. Now, yes, but there was a former will, and that forged will was so clumsily executed, the signature so carelessly imitated, that the forgery was bound to come to light. Did that ever strike you? Yes, but... There is no but, he interrupted. It was always clear as daylight to me from the very first. The quarrel with the old man which broke his heart was not with his eldest son, with whom he was so used to quarreling, but with a second son whom he idolized and whom he believed. Don't you remember how John O'Neill heard the words liar and deceit? Percival Brooks never deceived his father. His sins were all on the surface. Murray had led the quiet life and pandered to his father and fawned upon him until, like most hypocrites, he was last found out. Who knows what ugly gambling debt or debt of honor suddenly revealed to old Brooks? What's the cause of the last and deadly quarrel? You remember that it was Percival who remained beside the father and carried him up to his room. Where was Murray through that long, painful day? When his father lay, dying, he, the idolized son, the apple of the old man's eye. You never hear the name mentioned as being present there that day. But he knew that all had offended his father mortally, and that his father meant to cut him off without a shilling. He knew that Mr. Weatherd had been sent for, and that Weatherd left the house soon after 4 o'clock. And there the cleverness of man comes in. Having lain in wait, Weatherd knocked him on the back of the head with a stick. They could not very well make that will disappear altogether. There remained the faint chance of some other witnesses knowing that Mr. Brooks had made a fresh will. Mr. Weatherd's partner, his clerk, or one of those confidential servants in the house. Therefore, a will must be discovered after the old man's death. Now, Murray Brooks is not an expert forger. It takes years of training to become that. A forged will executed by himself will be sure to be found out. Yes, that's it, sure to be found out. A forgery will be palpable. Let it be palpable, and then it will be found out, branded as such, and the original will of 1891, so favorable in the young blackguard's interest, will be held as valid. It was devilry, and merely additional caution which prompted Murray to pin the forged will so glaringly in Percival's favor. It is impossible to say. Anyhow, it was the cleverest touch that the marvelously devised crime. To plan the evil deed was great. To execute it was easy enough. He had several hours' leisure in which to do it. Then at night it was simplicity itself to slip the document on the dead man's pillow. Sacrilege causes no shudder to such natures as Murray Brooks. The rest of the drama you already know. But Percival Brooks... The jury returned a verdict of not guilty. There was no evidence against him. But the money... Surely the scoundrel does not still have the enjoyment of it. No, he enjoyed it for a time, but he died about 3 months ago, and forgot to take the precaution of making a will, so his brother Percival has got the business after all. If you ever go to Dublin, I should order some of Brooks' bacon if I were you. It is very good.